14th lesson of the depth study looks at life in Nazi Germany as it pertains to the youth. We'll look at both what the Nazis did to get the youth on their side and why, and then we'll juxtapose that with what happens if the youth weren't necessarily into what the Nazis want. And then we'll talk about what type of opposition came from the youth and how that looked, and really, in essence, how big it was. So what were his aims for the kids? Hitler really wanted to control all aspects of life in Nazi Germany. And as a consequence of that, he needed to ensure that those who were born into Nazi Germany grew up being indoctrinated from an early age into the Nazis he wanted. Therefore, education and the creation of youth movements, such as the very famous and infamous Hitler Youth, were major parts of how the Nazis aimed to reach children to sort of indoctrinate them in the Nazi ethos. The Nazis were pretty broadly aware that if the Third Reich was going to last for 1,000 years, then it was necessary to produce the future generations that were going to be loyal to it. The Nazis therefore aimed to change the schools. Before 1933, German schools were under the control of all of the various state governments in Germany. There were Bavarian school districts, there were Prussian school districts, for example. The Nazis centralized this, which means that instead of allowing the states to decide on education, they bring everything under the Nazi Party and the federal government. And they place schools under what they call the Ministry of Education. And this ensures that all schools, A, teach the same thing, and B, ensure that they're all coordinated to the Nazi message. Now, teachers, of course, the people who do the teaching and the delivering of the curriculum, were coordinated by the Nazis. This meant that teachers all were forced to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler, and if you refused to swear to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler, you would lose your job. Teachers who were Jewish were sacked immediately. You could add to this list teachers who had been members of the socialist or communist parties before the Nazis came to power were also sacked. Curriculum in Germany was changed, and this was really to account for the Nazi ideas. For instance, biology and history were probably the two most affected of the groups. Now, the textbooks were rewritten to reflect Nazi racial biology. The Nazis basically wanted to show that, sort of biologically anyway, that they were the next step on Germany's road to greatness. They scrapped religious education. The Nazis, no big fans of religion. And they put much more emphasis on the development of the physical attributes that are required for strong, powerful German soldiers. And therefore, physical education was really emphasized in Nazi schooling, actually taking up as much as 15% of your day. Here are some examples of the change in curriculum. We can kind of go through these. I'll give you a couple examples. Biology teachers instructed to emphasize the concept of the master race. Therefore, they talk about, instead of real biology, the danger of mixing races. Women were taught basically the importance of choosing and how to choose a racially fit mate in which to breed with. In each classroom, you had to have a racial corner where a student could go and learn all about the benefits of the Aryan race and the lack of benefits of other races. Geography focused on how the Treaty of Versailles had robbed Germany, the need for living space, the problems of Jewish migration as they saw it. Physics and chemistry, they focused on the military application of science. So for a really good example about how many chemicals you need to make an artillery shell explode effectively, for example. History was reformatted. Of course, Hitler has entered into history. You learned about his youth and his service in the First World War. You learned in history about how Hitler was the next great German leader in a line of great German leaders, from Frederick the Great to Bismarck to Hindenburg and eventually to Hitler. Maths used to make political points. So, for instance, students were asked to make calculations of how many aircraft could be made, or how much money could be saved if we got rid of the mentally disabled. And of course, PE was designed to ensure young men would be able to bear arms and to fight for the German cause. Hitler Youth. Outside of school, children were encouraged and later on forced to, by 1936 anyway, to join the Hitler Youth. This was an organization, as you recall, established in the 1920s by the Nazi Party itself. By 1934, with the Nazis in power, they banned most other youth movements except the Hitler Youth. excuse me, the Hitler Youth was led by a guy named Baldur von Schirach. He was a Reich's youth leader, and he organized this into separate sections for boys and girls. There were different organizations, in fact, based on your age. By 1936, you had 1 million youths who didn't join the Hitler Youth, but the overwhelming majority of German youth did. I think numbers in the Hitler Youth were pushing 7 or 8 million by 1939, for example. Um, the design of the Hitler Youth was intended to make a good generation of soldiers. People were taught to drill, they were taught discipline, camping, map reading, cleaning and firing a rifle. They further enhanced fitness by focusing on athletics and competitions between all the boys. They did cross country running, they did trekking, mountain climbing, cross country skiing in the winter. They also received heaping amounts of political indoctrination, where they had to listen to speeches by Hitlers. They learned about the evils of Jewry as they saw it, the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, and they all became intimately acquainted with the minute details of Hitler's heroic rise to power and his life as a war hero. Of course, all of that is just the propaganda myth, though that sort of built up around Hitler, but certainly boys were indoctrinated in this nonstop. They were tend to look at Hitler as almost like the godlike father figure of the Hitler Youth, and I think it's pretty obvious when you look at the nature of the picture to the right of the writing. For women, you were forced to join the League of German Maidens. Translated, the German acronym for that was the BDM. For girls, you joined at the age of 14. Girls and were basically prepared from the age of 14 to prepare them for motherhood. The Nazis considered women's role in society was best served as stay-at-home mothers who both had lots of children for the Greater Reich and to, sort of put out the master race, and also a woman who would support her husband, take care of the children, and raise them right in the Nazi ethos. So they learned things like nutrition, cooking, clothes making, shopping, racial biology, how to wash stains out of a military uniform, and some other different things like that. As with all things in the Nazi regime, we have to estimate whether the Nazis were totally successful in their ability to do the indoctrination that was required. And there was lots of opposition. For instance, teenage rebels. Most enjoyed the sporting and leisure activities of the Hitler Youth, but it wasn't to everyone's taste. A lot of middle and upper class kids started to join things that they called the swing movement. Now, in culture, Hitler banned anything American, and swing music was popular in the clubs of the New York City, for instance, or Chicago in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And the middle and upper class kids who idolized this type of music started to grow their hair long, listened to jazz music, and they danced dances that were considered risque, such as the jitterbug. The movement tends to be centered around some bars and clubs, predominantly in Hamburg and Berlin, the capital. The kids who join these groups or do this, they're not necessarily overtly political. They're not making a massive anti Nazi stance, but they basically are saying that we do not want to follow the rigid regimentation of Nazi life. Their loose morals, the fact that they engage in relationships outside of wedlock, male, female, and occasionally not, um, uh, and their preference for American and English culture meant that they were objectionable to the Nazis. Many of these teenage rebels were arrested during the war. In 1941, 300 were arrested. The leaders of these groups were sent to concentration camps. The rest would have their hair cut and they were sent back to school to be re-indoctrinated under close supervision of the SS. Who are the groups that we're referring to? Now, the most famous of them all is a group known as the Edelweiss Pirates. This is a group of working class kids, most of them 14 to 17. A couple cities in the Ruhr, Rhineland region. Essen, for instance, a group of kids sort of under the umbrella of the Edelweiss Pirates. They called themselves the Roving Dudes. And in Cologne, they called themselves the Navajos. They all shared, even though they were different in their form and they weren't necessarily centrally led, a distaste for the sexual segregation of the Hitler Youth, the fact that the boys had to be in one group and the girls in the other, and there was no communication between the two. The The concept of the Edelweiss pirates believes in freedom of expression. They collected in gangs on street corners. They sang anti Nazi songs very provocatively. They taunted the Hitler Youth. They painted anti Nazi graffiti on the walls and on public buildings, predominantly those built by the Nazis in the 1930s. During the war, though, although the Nazis were able to tolerate a little bit of this of dissent, not a lot, but a bit, and the fact that the Edelweiss pirates are a relatively small group and they're spread out in different cities means that the Nazis, watched them but didn't necessarily really punish them. But by the time the war was on, there was a need for absolute 100% conformity, 100% commitment to the Nazi cause, and their activities were therefore deemed more threatening, and not to mention the fact that most of them hated the war, or they were pacifists and they didn't want to fight, really made groups like the Edelweiss Pirates targets for the Nazis. So what they did during the war is they, in fact, sabotaged some Nazi things. They would do things like cut the power lines. They would shelter people or hide people who had run away from the army. They're called deserters. And they would distribute Allied propaganda leaflets that have either been given to them by Allied spies or dropped into German cities, as was typical at that particular time. In 1944, the Gestapo had had enough. In Cologne, the Gestapo chief arrests 12 of the leaders of the Edelweiss Pirates, a group referring to themselves as the Navajos, and they're put on trial briefly. They're all found guilty of anti-Nazi activity, and they're publicly hanged. The rest, I said, like I had mentioned earlier, had their heads shaven and sent, or sent to concentration camps. Here, unfortunately, is the public execution of the Edelweiss pirates, and it gives you a sort of an idea of what they're at. Just to summarize here, Nazi youth aimed at indoctrinating people. In large part, it was overwhelmingly popular. There were some small opposition, predominantly in German cities, of people who didn't like the Nazis. Some just manifested that in doing things American, or like reading English books, or like things like the poet Dylan Thomas, or for example, listening to American jazz music and dancing dances that the Nazis considered degenerate, like the jitterbug. Others formed into groups that became, expertly in the war, more aggressive. These guys were known as the Edelweiss Pirates, and by the time the middle of the war hit, 1944, the Nazis cracked down on them really hard, and their leaders were publicly executed, as evidenced here.